Good afternoon, everybody. We are live. Hello to our Facebook audience. Could we have everybody's attention?
Can everyone turn off phones?
I hear a lot of noise from the peanut gallery back there. All right. I hope everyone enjoyed lunch and you're ready for this afternoon's panel. This morning we had quite a rousing discussion, some great role playing, and I hope that we'll have even more this afternoon. I want to stop just for a moment, and I want to recognize somebody who could not be here today, but she's somebody that I respect as an advocate. I met her 5 years ago when I began working at the East Bay Center for the Blind. She was the previous president of the board of directors here at East Bay Center, and she paved the way in so many ways for what Dorothy Dunaville is doing now. She's dealing with a lot of medical problems right now, and unfortunately she could not be here. But it's so much thanks to her advocacy and thanks to a lot of the work she did at the East Bay Center that we've gotten to this day where we can hold such a successful workshop. So I want to recognize Anita March right now. And we hope she'll be able to join us for future workshops. So let's get started. So this afternoon we are going to continue our discussion of advocacy and how to advocate for yourself and others in various situations. This morning we kind of talked about the basics. We talked about basic problems that might occur, the kind of skill sets and the kind of resources you can put in your toolkit. We're going to talk this afternoon about more complicated problems that might arise, that might require some more involved legal intervention, or that might involve getting the whole community together. Sometimes we can't resolve a problem just on our own. It's going to take more than just one of us making phone calls. It might involve what we call community organizing to get everybody involved in a particular issue. So let me introduce our guests. We have Michael Nunez, who is a associate at, let's see if I can pronounce this correctly, RBGG, which stands for, Michael, help me with that, so I don't...
It's Rosen, Bean, Galvin, and Grunfeld.
Rosen, Bean, Garvin, and Grunfeld. Did I do that correctly?
Galvin.
Galvin. Thank you. Can anyone want me to say that 10 times fast? Grunfeld.
Yes.
Okay. He used to be a staff attorney at Disability Rights Advocates, which is how I met him initially. And he specializes in civil rights law and disability law. We also have with us today Dolores Tejada, who was a community organizer at Community Resources for Independent Living in Hayward, and she is now a disability programs consultant, and she works with San Francisco Bay Area Women Against Rape. So she's going to be talking with us about community organizing, and Michael is going to be talking with us about the law. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let both of them give a better introduction, a more involved one than I gave. So I'm going to pass the microphone to Dolores first.
We have a question?
Just a second. Yes?
Do we need to ask people to turn off their cell phones?
Yep. Yep.
If people could you please turn off your cell phones? It will make the live stream smoother. I'll give a second for all the AT&T and Verizon noises.
Take it easy.
So when we get blind people in a room, this is what happens. Somebody's out here waiting a long time. Okay, I'm gonna hand the microphone to Dolores now.
Hi everyone, my name is Dolores Tejada. I have experience as a community organizer over the past like 15 years. Most recently, I was a community organizer at Community Resources for Independent Living in Hayward, and now I am a disability access and programs consultant. I'm working with San Francisco Women Against Rape to build their disability and deaf services program. So I'm excited to talk to you today. I have a little bit of an overview. I definitely want to talk again, I'm sure it's not the first time we're going to hear it, about the importance of voting and community organizing and advocacy, as well as mobilizing and what that looks like. So some concrete organizing tactics to share with you. And then also what a legislative visit looks like, which is a huge part of community organizing. And so those are just some of the things that I hope to share with you, as well as answer any questions.
And Michael, would you like to give
Sure.
an introduction?
Hi everybody, I'm Michael Nunez. I'm an attorney at Rosendean, Galvin and Grunfeld. I've been focusing much of my time on disability rights litigation. I also do employment work and some prison litigation now. So, but a majority of my experience and specialization is in disability law, and it's a field that I really hold near and dear to my heart and have really enjoyed working on. I am from Southern California and have been privileged to call the Bay Area my home for the past 15 years, at least most of the past 15 years. So today I am going to speak with you about sort of an overview of, just a general overview of laws and regulations in this space, in disability rights space, and then also to give you guys examples of the kinds of legal resources that may be around in the Bay Area who can and that can assist you if you come across advocacy issues where you think that legal assistance may be appropriate or may be helpful. So I will also give you examples of a few types of cases that my firm has worked on in the disability space and continues to work on. Some of it sounds like will dovetail nicely with what Dolores is speaking about, voting, because we've done some work recently on access to vote-by-mail voting for voters with print disabilities. So it's a timely topic. So now that I've sort of given the intro, Leah, shall I pass the microphone back to you, or?
Yeah,
Okay,
for just a minute.
great.
So let me just introduce a few scenarios. These are things that potentially Michael and his law firm or others that do similar work could help you with. We talked this morning about scenarios where you're trying to fill out forms, or you're trying to deal with the Comcast representative when your modem's not working. And we talked this morning about getting some of those types of situations settled either by just talking, helping the person feel more comfortable with you, negotiation, a more structured negotiation setting, or mediation. Well, there's times where all of those approaches unfortunately don't work. So let me bring a couple. Has anyone ever been to a movie and the audio description did not work?
Yep.
Right? That's a common one. And sometimes you talk to the customer service folks and they're really nice about it. And maybe they offer you a free ticket to another movie. Can anybody tell me a potential problem, however, with that solution? Getting a free ticket. What's it?
It doesn't really solve the solution. Just, somebody else will have the same problem next time.
Okay, thanks. That's what I was looking for, Michael. So you might go with your free ticket next time, and the audio description still might not work.
You have to talk to a representative, somebody if they're besides that issue there to see if they can resolve that.
Right, Josie, so you're saying you need to take it to a higher level,
Yes.
correct?
Yes, by all means.
So let's say that you've done that, but you've gone to this theater a number of times and it still is a problem.
Then it'll be time for a lawsuit.
Well, it's time to take some more measures, and that's Also, let's, sorry, Josie.
Not quite that yet, like you said, you just really say.
Let's talk about voting. Let's say that you go to the polls and you're all excited that you're going to be able to fill out your ballot all by yourself. And they load it, and guess what happens? That's right. The audio portion of it does not work, and they keep you sitting there for a couple hours while they try to sort it out, and they're not able to. Okay, that's a more complex problem than the kind of situations that we talked about this morning. The other piece sometimes is, before we look into legal action, a lot of times we find that more than one person is dealing with these problems or similar problems. A lot of you come to the center every day, and guess what you're angry about?
Paratransit.
Paratransit was late. Paratransit didn't pick you up on time, or a few of you.
They come too early.
Yes.
Or they don't even show up at all.
Or they don't show up at all. A few of you I've sat with at the center till long past closing time because they don't show up. That's the kind of thing, all of you come and you talk about that together, correct?
Right.
That's where this concept of community organizing comes in. You all have a similar problem, and you need to organize together to try to work out a solution. Okay, so those are two approaches that we are going to talk about today. So, Michael or Dolores, do either of you have a preference right now as to which one of you wants to take this conversation and go through your overviews?
Dolores, maybe.
Okay.
It seems to me that maybe it makes sense to go with community organizing first.
Sure.
Microphone.
Okay, because generally, community organizing might actually be the first step before we start looking at legal solutions. So I'm going to hand the microphone to Dolores now.
Can you repose the question?
So the question would be, let's say that you have an issue that does not just affect you. For instance, here in the blindness community, we deal with paratransit a lot, okay? So it affects us a bunch of people. How would the concept of community organizing fit into possibly creating solutions for the problems surrounding that?
Awesome, thank you so much. This is Dolores again. So community organizing really at its core is about people power, right? And people power is all of you, the folks in this room, recognizing that you have a communal power to make change. So that's the first thing to recognize, is that everyone's stronger in numbers. It's one thing to hear it from one person, but if you're hearing it from 10 people, 20 people, 100 people, that makes all the difference. So community organizing has a lot of different steps. One of the steps is really getting together, right? So the actual organizing piece of bringing people together into a shared space and doing the education. So talking through what the issue is. For disability communities that I've worked with, it can be really hard to get everyone in the same room. And that's just because of people's capacity. So one of the things that, in terms of community organizing, it's really important to make one-on-one connections with people and to get to why it is they care about a particular issue, and to make sure that they have the space and they also recognize that there is capacity to change what their issue is and address their issue. One of the classic tactics of community organizing is when you set up a meeting, is you ask the people you're inviting into that space, you ask them to be responsible for something. So maybe you're going to have someone come in and you're going to tell them, hey, I'm creating the agenda. Do you want to talk about your paratransit issue? And they're going to say like, yes, I really need a space to talk about this. More than likely, they'll say like, yes, I really want to be there. And you're going to tell them, all right, you're in charge of that agenda item and talking about it with the group. So they're automatically responsible for something, and they're going to have a buy-in to come into that space. Another easy thing to do is you tell people there's going to be food there. If you have food and you are going to feed people, that'll increase your numbers, guaranteed.
Yep.
The other way to do it is you have a potluck, right? And that's the other way to make people responsible. So you say, hey, we're gonna have a potluck. Would you mind bringing a pack of napkins? Hey, can you bring some pretzels? Can you bring a 2-liter of soda? So folks feel responsible for something and something that they're contributing. So that's just a really basic way to get people into the shared space. And community organizing really is about getting the individual to share their individual issue and connecting it to how it affects the whole community, right? So for example, with paratransit serves a lot of people in the community. So a lot of us those of us who use paratransit are going to experience a lot of the issues that come up with paratransit. So you're not alone, right? There's going to be other people who face the same issues that you do. So it's about coming into this shared space and saying, what is it, trying to figure out what it is that is causing those issues to come up. Is there some sort of problem? And also the thing about it too is that you don't have to come up with all the solutions, right? The solutions should really come from paratransit. Your role is to tell them, these are the problems, here's how you're not serving us. And when you have 10 people in the room, 20 people in the room, they're going to say like, wow, this is a lot of people that we serve. This is a huge issue that's coming up. Everyone also has a boss. So if you're reaching to someone and you can't get through to that person, you ask who their boss is. Paratransit has an advisory board. That's one way. The advisory board should be made up of consumers, people who are actually on paratransit. That's another way to get through to paratransit. So you want to find all the doors, all the options to communicate your issues with a particular agency, right? And when you go there and you're not alone and you have your issues, they're going to have to listen to you. So the community organizing piece is about getting all the people in the same room, and that is not an easy task, right? I gave you some tips on how to do that. The biggest thing that I can say is you really have to make one-on-one connections with your community. There's so many of you in this space. I'm sure if you had a meeting on paratransit, I'm sure you've had a meeting on paratransit, a lot of you are going to show up and care about it. So those meetings are really about figuring out what the core issues are and what the next steps are. And again, you don't have to have all the solutions, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. You just need to pinpoint the problems. And the community organizing piece is sharing your problems with the folks that need to hear it.
Dolores, can I ask you a question? So can you talk about the difference between, because we get a lot of this here at the East Bay Center, people come in and they talk over coffee about how paratransit did this, how paratransit did that, and there's about 5 to 10 people complaining about paratransit. What is the difference between getting together in a social situation like this and complaining about it as opposed to getting together at a community meeting?
So the community organizing piece is the action step. It's figuring out what are we going to do next? How do we reach our solution? So you can't just sit around a table and talk about it forever. Mm-hmm. You have to organize. You have to come together and think about what are the action steps that we are going to do, and then you have to do them. So community organizing is about reaching and advocating for yourself to reach the solution that you need to make your communities better. So the action step is a really important piece. At a community meeting, you're gonna learn more about what the issues are from other perspectives, right? You're going to be with people who are sharing some of the similar or same experiences as you. And hopefully the goal of the community meeting is to think about the action steps. And then designating responsibilities, again, right? Designating responsibility to individuals in order to achieve those next action steps. And give yourself a timeline, give yourself a date to reach out and say, hey, I did this piece. And that's really the crux of community organizing, is that you're doing it together as a group, and you're achieving those, you're identifying the action steps, and then doing the steps to actually complete those action steps.
Any questions on those points?
Okay, hold on. Raise your hand.
Mike the mic runner is out.
Josie.
For years, many people.
There we go. Raise your hands, anybody.
Right here in front. You had a.
I can't see. Anybody got their hands up?
Josie did.
Oh, okay. There you go.
For years, we've been doing that and calling Celeste. She was the head of that area paratransit. Oh, many years ago, we used to go to the Lion Center, and they used to hold meetings even over there. And many a times, everybody would in orchestra just completely would tell this lady all about the scenario, all the things that they were going through. And many times, some situations were taken care of, and others just weren't. They were just either ignored or they just didn't know what to do. And for years, this has been going on and on and on. And now we have an opportunity to get together again and go either to the headquarters up there and explain to them or tell them what's going on and how we feel about this. And the way we can all clear up for the satisfaction of the people and the safety of all of us riders on this paratransit system. That's it.
I think you touched on something really important when you said that now you're kind of starting over because there's some of the situations have been handled, some of the problems have been handled, but not all of them have. So that's also part of community organizing. Is sometimes you have to start back at square one and you do those steps again. You gather people, you share information, you figure out what the collective problems are, you think of action steps to get to the solution. And again, you don't have to think of the solution, you need to reach the right people whose responsibility it is to think of the solutions and then implement them.
So I had a couple things. One, I'll ask the question last so you can answer. We won't forget maybe. Of course, I might forget before I get to it. Anyway, I'm thinking that this center is a great place for people to start coming together and talking about paratransit and then, or whatever other issues you have, and then for us to take the action steps and take it further. And I think that there are people here who can do that, and I think otherwise we're just, like Leah said, we're just sitting here kvetching and we don't get anything really accomplished except to maybe feel better for tomorrow when the next ride doesn't show up or is late. So I think that that's something to really think about around this center. This is a community center, and people come here and you come here for other things, so you can add into those other things organizing around issues like paratransit and other things, and really making the most of having this space, and also the time that you're here in between other things, while you have a ride to get here and everything, to start really planning some action steps. And the other thing I want to ask is the advisory committee for these various transportation things like paratransit and AC transit and all of those. I wonder sometimes how much clout they have. How much does paratransit really listen to them? And if they don't, then what can we do to help reinforce them doing that more?
So one thing I can share is that paratransit gets its funding from the government. So the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the MTA, they're the folks that are responsible for designating funds for transportation throughout the entire Bay Area. So if you take, with any agency, when you talk about their funding streams, they're going to get really scared. So if you are, again, everybody has a boss, right? So if you go to the Metropolitan Transportation Authority because in this case paratransit isn't being responsive to your needs, that's again the next step. That's finding the boss of paratransit. The other thing is that because they are a government agency or receive money from the government, you have representatives. You have assembly members in your area, you have senators in your area, you have the board of supervisors in your area. Those are all folks who weigh some authority over any agency and government funding. So I would also recommend connecting with those folks. But I think with community organizing, it's really hard, right? It's not an easy process. It's really hard to get people to think about the solutions but the positive thing is that our communities, disability communities, blind communities, have a rich history of doing community organizing and doing advocacy work and being successful at it. So you are all already a part of a huge legacy of people who have achieved changes to get to where we are today. And it's kind of our own individual responsibility to say, how am I going to keep that momentum going? How am I going to keep that legacy going? And that's the kind of things that I think about when I'm doing advocacy work. And I'm thinking about what's going to keep me moving. And I think about the rich history of disability organizing. And I think about, there's a lot of history of what we've achieved. So now let's even take it to the next level. And there's a strength in that collective community and that collective history that we share.
Okay, any other questions? Hold up your hand high, because sometimes I can't see that far.
All the way in the back on the couch.
Where? I don't see anything. Okay.
Amy and Ken.
I think one of the problems too is that when we talk about community meetings, is that sometimes if you're working, for some people, it's hard to get away. And how can we suggest to them about maybe having a community meeting on Saturday? But the other problem is that the other question is if they would be willing to show up. Of course, the unfortunate thing is not every community organization is willing to do that, like we are. So you run into that kind of scenario too. And I know I used to go to meetings, paratransit and so forth, East Bay. So how can we resolve that?
So part of the strength of community organizing is that you're not alone. So if there's a meeting that you can't go to, if you're connected to a network, to a group of people, maybe it means that there's 3 or 4 representatives that can go and report back at the next time you meet. And so I was going to do this a little bit later, but I think it's cool to do now. So I want everyone to think about any time you're talking to someone about an advocacy issue. It could be a personal advocacy issue or a community advocacy issue. So I want everyone to lift up their hand. Either hand works fine, and extend your fingers if you can to the capacity that you can. So this is a strategy that I learned from a colleague when doing legislative visits in particular, but it works again when you're advocating for anything. So when you are telling your story, which is the crux of what you're doing, when you're meeting with anyone who has some sort of deciding power, you want to touch on 5 things. You want to think about the power of your hand. So your thumb represents you. So tell them how this issue affects you. Your pointer finger represents your friend. So, or a partner or whoever. How does it represent someone that you are in close contact with? How does it affect someone that you're in close contact with? Your middle finger is your family. How does this affect your family? And the next finger is how does it affect your job? if you're not working, if a lot of, unemployment is super high, but how does it affect your job? If you can't get to your job on time, how does that look to your boss? The other side of it is, if you maybe don't have a job but you have an IHSS worker, how does it affect your IHSS worker if this particular issue keeps happening? And the last part is how it affects your community. So when you're going to speak to people in power, think about talking about your hand, basically, the power of the folks that you can count on one hand. And when you're sharing your story, touch on all those different aspects, because basically what that means is you're one person, but you're representing 5 other people or more. So you're going to tell them all these different connections that you're making, and that it doesn't just affect you. It affects your family, your friend, your neighbor, your job, your IHSS worker, your community, etc. And then they're going to go, oh wow, like it's not just about this one individual, it's about everybody. So that's a super powerful tactic that I always carry with me when I'm speaking about an advocacy issue.
Dolores? Yeah.
Can I just give you a personal example of that so that we can relate it to something concrete? About 6 or 7 years ago, I worked at Lighthouse for the Blind in San Francisco, and there was an escalator, there was an exit by a Burger King there that a lot of people use,
Yep.
okay, to walk to Lighthouse.
Yep.
This escalator was closed for a long time. It was blocked off. And a lot of us were getting confused about how to take an alternate route to the Lighthouse. And it was something that it affected me first. So Dolores was talking about, you have a story that affects you. I discovered that it was affecting other people. It was affecting my friends. It was affecting fellow employees who were having trouble. Ultimately, it actually affected my roommate, who worked very late in San Francisco, and a cab dropped her off at that particular exit, not knowing that the escalator was broken.
Oh.
She couldn't figure out how to get to the station. She couldn't figure out how to cross the street to get to the other side. And she ended up missing the last BART train to the East Bay. Okay?
Oh my gosh.
And she called me and her other roommate, and we're trying desperately to find a way to get her home, and it ended up costing her about $100 in cab fare. Okay? So finally, we all really reached a boiling point, because I had been calling BART periodically to talk about this issue. So ultimately what I ended up doing with a couple other people, because we reached sort of this fever pitch, an anger level got to my friend couldn't get home, There was enough anger about it. A few of us got together and we wrote a press release about what happened, particularly that example. I sent it with some help from some other folks involved. We sent it to a number of newspapers. We sent it to some BART supervisors. We sent it to some disability listservs. Well, guess what happened about 2 days later? I received a phone call from a head honcho at BART. This is after weeks of making phone calls. And what they said was, let's have a community meeting at Lighthouse to discuss this. Okay? This goes directly into what Dolores is talking about. At that community meeting, a lot of us got together and we were able to express to some supervisors at BART what we were dealing with in this particular situation and scenario, and also other issues that have come up with BART and exits and problems. And it was an extremely productive meeting, and we reached some resolutions. And by the way, my friend got 10 red BART tickets. Okay, so this definitely demonstrates what Dolores is saying and how successful these community meetings can be once people care enough about an issue and when they're willing to work hard enough to make some change occur. It takes a lot of work. Okay? I'm thinking about bringing it to Michael at this point, and I want to come back to you, Dolores, about voting. I want to make sure we get into that a little bit later. but I want to talk to Michael about some approaches that might be taken when these resolutions don't work. For instance, we could go back as an example to the audio description problem at theaters and trying to reach a resolution for that sort of issue.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, this is Michael again. So thanks, Leah, for that lead-in, and thank you, Dolores, for that awesome presentation. So, as Leah pointed out, legal representation and a legal approach can sometimes be an effective strategy when other approaches haven't been able to achieve the results that you're looking to achieve. And so, taking the legal path raises a number of preliminary questions. And the first question that needs to be resolved is this something that a legal sort of approach can address? And to boil it down, is the issue that concerns me, that's bothering me, that's a problem for me, is it a violation of the law? That's the question you need to ask. Now, you can turn to a number of legal advocates around the Bay Area or beyond who can assist you with that kind of question. And it is not always 100% clear what the answer might be to someone who doesn't have much experience in law. Sometimes the answer to that question can be complicated even for lawyers. So the ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. I think it's probably the most well-known law for disability rights in the United States, but there are a number of others. The ADA covers access to public accommodations. That means restaurants, movie theaters, museums, all sorts of other kinds of businesses, amusement parks, even places that aren't businesses, like parks that are owned by private companies, and other types of places that you might not go to make purchases, but that would still be covered if they're basically operated or owned by a private entity, a non-governmental entity. It's probably going to be covered. It also covers access to government services offered by state and local governments, so the state of California, counties, cities. And then it also covers access to employment, and the ADA covers most employers. Now, there are a number of other disability rights laws. There's the Rehabilitation Act, that's a federal law, and that applies to the executive branch of the federal government, and then also to sort of all sorts of entities on the ground that receive federal money. So if they receive money from the federal government, to fund some program, then they're covered. Then there's, the Air Carrier Access Act, which applies to airlines. And then there are a bunch of state laws, and they vary from state to state. Here in California, we're really lucky to have very strong state disability access laws that are at least as strong and broad as the Americans with Disabilities Act, and in some ways they're broader. So we have the California Unruh Civil Rights Act, the California Disabled Persons Act, and the California Fair Employment and Housing Act. And so putting that big patchwork of laws together means that a lot of access is protected by state or federal laws. But just because the statutes, the laws apply, doesn't necessarily mean that they guarantee that you can do the thing that, or you can address, the particular issue that is concerning you at the moment. So, first things first is that you may wish to reach out to a lawyer around the Bay Area or elsewhere to sort of discuss the issue that is a problem for you. So for example, tying it back to what we were discussing regarding audio description access, so there are actually ADA regulations that require that movie theaters provide audio description as an auxiliary aid to blind folks. And those regulations sort of also require that those things work, that they not just be this broken pile of defunct equipment in the back room. It actually needs to be functional, and there need to be employees who are on staff and on site during business hours who know how to make them work. So, so the answer to that first preliminary question about whether or not the law can be a helpful tool, and that situation was yes, the law applied. And this all started back in the context of audio description. We started, when I was back at Disability Rights Advocates, about 3.5 years ago, hearing from folks that audio description equipment at AMC movie theaters was not working very well. So, we started looking into it, and this is kind of where the kind of community organizing piece kind of ties in a little bit, because Disability Rights Advocates is one of several legal entities here in the Bay Area that works on disability rights issues, but DRA and many other orgs seek to work on sort of bigger impact kind of class action style cases. The idea being, DRA and other folks, they have limited resources. They have a limited number of attorneys who can only work on so many matters at one time. And so to have the biggest impact, they are often aiming to work on cases that will have kind of a broad impact for a large number of people, to try to get the biggest bang for their kind of attorney time, if you can think of it in that way. So we started to communicate with the existing disability groups, like the California Council of the Blind, the Lighthouse for the Blind, the Lions Center, folks who are already plugged into many blind, sort of large centers of blind people who are interested in using audio description and who would be concerned about using audio description. And the thinking was, one, figure out whether this is a big, broad impact kind of issue, and if so, who are the folks being impacted? Is it a problem just at one theater? Is it a problem at all the theaters? Or something in between? So back in 2014, during the spring, we started to talk to folks, and then we, once we had enough data to determine that this was clearly a problem that spread well beyond just one theater or even a handful of theaters, we did something that disability rights lawyers and lawyers in all sorts of other sort of contexts will also do, which is we took the first step in starting down that legal letter. It's sometimes referred to a bleaching letter, which is like this long-winded term of art, but basically just a letter that outlines the problem, that says who we are representing and what we and our clients are asking the company to do to fix the problem. And so, that will vary from situation to situation. In the audio description situation, we were representing the California Council of the Blind and several individual blind folks who had had problems accessing audio description at AMC theaters. And so we prepared a letter along those lines that sort of sets out the problem, explains that, look, audio description needs to be functional, and not providing access to audio description is a violation of the ADA and state disability laws. And then setting forth some requests saying, please let us know if you're willing to commit to take these various steps to improve access to audio description. So the goal in that letter is to start the dialogue and hopefully get the attention of the people in decision-making positions, the people with authority at the company, to realize that our clients are serious about the issue and that they are, taking the next step to try to advocate for better access. And oftentimes, a lawyer will be retained by a client who thinks and is hoping that a letter from a lawyer is enough to get the attention of the head honchos or the decision makers and fix the problem. And that happens sometimes. Sometimes, depending on what the issue is and how easy or complicated it might be to fix it, sometimes a letter from a lawyer is enough to sort of fix the issue. But sometimes it's not. So in the AMC situation, we sent our letter to AMC in June 2014. And then we heard back from AMC in July 2014, or maybe it was August. And they basically said, hey, thank you for raising this concern. We don't actually think this is a widespread problem. We think the audio description works for the most part, and that you just happen to have a few clients who have had some unfortunate, bad, isolated experiences. So they said, give us a few months. We are going to do some extra training to resolve the matter. And we don't think that any sort of legal negotiation, structured negotiation is necessary. We'll have this covered, fixed in a few months. So, we said, okay, we should give them the opportunity to proactively resolve the issue if they think they can. They're in a position where they could, in theory, they could take the steps that they need to take to fix the problem internally if they were committed across the corporation. So a few months later, we get to the end of that 90-day period, and next rolls around 2015, and we continue to hear problems with audio description at AMC theaters. And we hear back from folks that say, hey, this is still a problem. I'm kind of upset that AMC said they were going to fix it, and it's long past the time they said they were going to fix it, yet it's still a problem for me. I think we need to take further action to address the issue. And so we started sort of looking into the issue again in the summer of 2015. So basically a year later, our back and forth. And we started to do to the community. So we would, we started to reach out to CB's members, to NFB's members, talking to folks through the Lighthouse channel, trying to get a sense of where the problem stood today, a year later. And we found that the problem was still pretty significant and pretty widespread. We found, that it was at many dozens of theaters, not only in California, but outside of California. And so we were doing stuff like in a learning about because there needs to be a solution for legal advocacy to make sense. If there's no way to get it, it's not clear that it would make sense for clients or lawyers to devote a lot of time and energy to a legal fight. But oftentimes there is a solution, and just a lack of will on the part of the people who have the power to sort of make that solution work for people. And so we learned about the audio description equipment, and later, in February 2016, we filed a lawsuit. It was a proposed class action lawsuit here in San Francisco in federal court against AMC regarding their failure to provide effective access to audio description equipment. So we filed that case with an ADA claim, and that started the ball rolling towards actually settlement discussions, which is interesting because that is something that we wanted all along. What our clients wanted all along was the opportunity to get into the room with decision makers who would have the power to change AMC's policies and practices to make audio description work better for people. And we more or less had not been getting that kind of access until we filed the lawsuit. which is another way of just getting attention in some respects to demonstrate how committed our clients were to pursuing an effective solution. And oftentimes in these disability cases, once the lawsuit is filed, settlement discussions only at that point take off, because at that point the people on the other side, whether it's a government agency or whether it is a private company, they realize, okay, these folks need business, this is going to become a protracted and expensive battle if we fight in court, and we're going to get a lot of bad press. And all of that sounds bad. It probably, at this point, would be easier to just see if we can fix the problem that these folks are raising. So that is essentially, generally, the course that we followed in AMC. So we started settlement talks in May of 2016, and it took quite some time. So we had numerous settlement meetings and mediation meetings here in San Francisco, and drafted settlement agreement drafts and traded them back and forth with negotiations, and ultimately reached a settlement agreement about 5 or 6 months ago. And so I believe that was executed in late April of this year. So the settlement agreement often is thought of as kind of the end of the case. It's like, okay, they agreed to do a bunch of stuff, we won, the rest is history. But it's actually, in many situations, it is not the end, it's actually just the beginning. And what I mean by that is, in some cases, the solution is a very discrete change that everybody can see has been accomplished, and then that's it. So, for instance, if a building has a bunch of stairs in the front, and that's the access problem, once you install a ramp, more or less the problem is fixed for wheelchair access to the building. But in a situation where you're talking about audio description, one of the big problems with making sure people were getting audio description is about staff training. It was about making sure that staff had not only training on a one-time basis, but on an ongoing basis, making sure that movies were added into AMC's computer systems in the proper way, making sure that audio description equipment is properly maintained and tested on a regular basis. So it's all sorts of ongoing activities that if people aren't watching and ensuring compliance, that stuff along those lines could sort of fall by the wayside or could sort of fall down the priority list. And so, my firm and I in particular really believe in the importance of monitoring in cases where there's kind of ongoing duties and responsibilities that companies or government agencies have to take in order to make sure that the access is continued to be provided on an ongoing basis. And so that process has, in the AMC case, has started. So the settlement agreement, took effect in, I want to say, late April, shortly after we all signed the papers. It might have been early May. But now we're in the monitoring phase in that case. And we are receiving complaints that AMC receives about audio description, and the Lighthouse will be conducting a testing program. The Lighthouse was one of the plaintiffs in the case, so Lighthouse will be conducting a testing program to sort of evaluate how effectively AMC is providing audio description to folks at theaters across the Bay Area and beyond. And we will be ensuring taking steps to ensure that AMC is living up to its commitments in the settlement agreement. So in the AMC case, and this is common across many disability rights cases, the court retained oversight over the case. So even though the settlement agreement was executed and the case is now sort of no longer active, the court has the power to enforce the agreement if AMC doesn't do what it's supposed to do under the agreement. And the lawyers on the legal team, our firm, along with our co-counsel, Disability Rights Advocates here in Berkeley, are tasked with the responsibility of making sure that AMC does what they're supposed to do, and if not, of holding them to account, either in a mediation or, if necessary, going all the way back to the court about, to pursue the settlement enforcement. So that is a common kind of path that many cases will take in this field. We've also worked on Uber access for people with service animals, and Lyft access for people with service animals. And like with AMC, those are cases where the settlement agreement is the start and not the end, because basically the settlement agreement sets forth clear processes for fixing issues that continue to come up, and ensures that there are people monitoring and keeping track of whether the companies are doing what they're supposed to do, and there's a clear process for enforcing the agreements when the companies fall short. And that is something I've been working on. I've been working on the Uber matter and the Lyft matter. In fact, when I leave later today, I'm going to go home and do work on the Uber monitoring for the rest of the afternoon. So it is something that we take very seriously at Rosenbein, Galvin, and Grunfeld, and I think our co-counsel takes very seriously as well. So, Leah, I'm hoping you can offer me some guidance in terms of where you'd like me to go next, or if you have questions or wanted to return back to Dolores before I say anything about voting, that would be great too.
I can. I just want to ask if we have any questions first before I take the microphone back. Yeah.
Okay,
He doesn't have a mic.
Not working.
It's still on.
Could be a dead battery.
That's not right.
If the light is red, does that mean the battery dead?
Can you hear me?
No.
That's the question.
Yeah, I can do that. If you state the question, I can repeat it through the microphone.
I was thinking about the paratransit thing with us, and it looks like we're going to have to go to the city council where we live, because what it is, every so often when you're listening to when you're on hold for paratransit, they list how the people that authorize the taxes to fund these issues, and they specify the issue in Contra Costa County, and they specify the issue that covered Oakland and Berkeley. And so what we would have to do is sort out where we all live and go to our local city councils, and in Contra Costa they might say, well, it's not our problem because they pick you up in Berkeley. So in that case, you say, well, then you should be concerned with this because you're not getting all the bang for all those tax dollars your people authorize. And the problem lies with Berkeley. You should get back to the Berkeley City Council to make sure they're holding up their end of the bargain. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think if we got together each of us who have a problem, say, here at the center, would get together and have a meeting, and we would each keep track of the times when we were picked up late, the exact date and how much, and how long we had to wait beyond our window before we could do anything really.
So, I didn't hear a question in there. Were you offering your comment?
I was inspired by what was said earlier about sometimes we all have to get together and get all the people who have the same problem to deal with the problem, whatever channels they need to work through.
Got it. Yeah. Well, thanks for that comment. So it sounds like your comment is basically that you are commending the value of community meetings to sort of collaborate amongst people who are having the same problems, and to share stories and notes and get a sense of how big of a problem things really are. And I think that sounds like it's both really helpful for from Dolores' perspective for community organizing, and I think that oftentimes in the context of class action litigation, sort of people getting together to share stories about the common problems is also very helpful for building an effective case.
Michael, this is David, and I just want to say to everybody that the next workshop is dealing with transportation and mobility, so we should make part of it a community organizing meeting. And I would suggest that all of you come on November 4th, and we're thinking of switching from 10 to 4 to make it even easier.
Yes.
Okay? So I hope that you all sign up, and I just want to say that there are so many other areas that Michael and Dolores want to touch on. And I appreciate our talk on paratransit, but I'd like to see if we can move it to other areas right now, because we'll have a lot to discuss on November 4th, but I appreciate the input. Just keep it coming.
Can we wake up the person who's snoring?
That's the dog.
Oh, it's a dog.
I think that's my dog.
Yeah.
My dog is a very vocal sleeper.
I have a question. Yeah, there's a dog.
Can I just interject here? Can somebody do a time check for me? Because my cell phone is off and it's in my pocket. Okay, yeah.
I have a question. Okay, when you're done.
Okay. There's another core issue I want to get to. How many of these questions are about paratransit? Because I really think that we will address a lot of this on November 4th. So if you have a question about paratransit, do you think you can build all that up till November?
No, it's not about
It's not about paratransit. Okay.
Senior citizen centers, they no video descriptive movies at the senior center where I live, and they show movies 1 week. So under what rubric, where would I go to try to get that changed?
Hi. Okay, so the question is, how might you, as a resident in a senior center, get your senior center to provide good movies?
Right.
So
They have closed caption for deaf people. So they have that.
Sure.
It's not
Sure.
my disability.
So I think the answer to that question requires that we take a step back, because this, I think, is a situation you would want to use and first review all of your tools in your advocacy toolkit. I think that step one is you would want to just ask them if they know about audio description and if they'd be willing to provide audio description movies. I have found that a lot of the public and other organizations out there just don't know very much about accessibility and tools and accessibility technology, audio description. So it's possible that if you just ask, they'll be happy to provide audio descriptive movies. Now, there are lots of different places where you can get audio description for viewing in a home or kind of a smaller setting, like the setting you might find in a, I think you said it was a retirement community?
No,
A senior center. In your senior center. Movies are listed. There's a website, I want to say it's the Audio Description Project website lists all of the different movies that are available on DVD with audio description and Blu-ray with audio description. And so that's a great place where you can find a large listing of movies, and you can point to that and say, hey, if you're having trouble finding them, this is a great selection of movies where you can show, if you're going to show a movie on DVD or Blu-ray anyways, you can just use one of these that has audio description, and please turn that on. Another place, all sorts of other resources are out there that have audio description libraries too, like iTunes and Netflix. But if they say no after you've asked, you want to find out why not. And I will say that for advocacy, from a lawyer's perspective, I often encourage folks to make these kinds of requests in writing and to ask for responses in writing. And the reason is because you want a sort of a record of what's, of the back and forth. You want a record of a denial. So that way it's just really clear. You don't want to get into this messy, squishy situation where there's like a he said, she said, and maybe you had some phone call with someone and they remember what was said differently than you do. It's really best to have a clear written record where you can say, look, right here on this page, on the third line, it says, I will not, this community center will not show audio description movies because we can't afford it, or something, whatever the reason is that is said. So that is another tip. You might want to use the community organizing. Are you the only person at your center who would benefit from audio description? And if not, ask the other folks whether it's something they want to. And if so, if you get a no when you make the first request on your own, maybe you can make a request in conjunction with other people, approach as a group and make that request. And that can come across as stronger because it shows that more people are concerned about the access that you're asking about. And if that doesn't work, then you can always reach out to people higher up the food chain at the center, the way that Dolores was talking about, to sort of try to advocate for the need to make sure that the center's programs are accessible to everyone and not just to sighted folks. If all the other strategies fail and don't achieve the results you want, you could also at some point reach out to an attorney, one of the disability rights attorneys, me or someone else in the Bay Area. There are disability rights advocates and Disability Rights Education Defense Fund and Goldstein, Borgen, Dargarian, and Ho, and ask them if it's something they might be able to help you with by writing a letter or having a phone call, or to even let you know whether they think that it's something a lawyer can help with.
I'll take that.
So, recently, just FYI, I have a website with a bunch of accessible movies on the computer here at East Bay Center. So come see me when you're here, and I can print out that list for you. But it just goes back to something that I want to make clear, because Lisa, Maria, and Frank talked about this morning. If you're having a particular problem with some kind of entity or organization, when you tell them there's a problem, it's a really good rule of thumb to offer them a solution to that problem. So instead of saying, I don't like this, or do this, okay, this poses a problem for some of us here. Here's a way it could be resolved so that they're not left open-ended with how to handle it. For instance, I had a problem with the city of Hayward where I lived a number of years ago, where the city planning department decided they were going to repave the street near where I lived, which was my direct route, and a number of other people in the neighborhood who are visually impaired to BART. Okay, they completely tore the street, the sidewalk apart on both sides. Okay, so it was a mess. So I called the city planning department and I said, this is going on. Some of us live here specifically because it's close to BART. Okay, but I did not say, fix it, do something about it. Okay, I can't believe the city did this to me. Okay, I thought about how can this be worked on, and what I did was I suggested to the city that they pay for a certain number of orientation and mobility hours. And in a lot of ways, the city planner I spoke to was relieved because that gave them a concrete solution to the problem. Okay, I pointed out too, hey, this is unsafe what you've got going on. This might hurt somebody. Okay, that immediately got them thinking about liability. So when you present a problem, try to present viable solutions because that will help them help you. Okay, I want to get on to another topic which is core to everything we're talking about. And Mike Kastner brought this up a few minutes ago. He talked about going to the city council. How do people in the city council get there? How do they get there? No. I don't mean how do they get to the meetings. I mean, how do they get on the city council?
You vote for them.
Thank you. Thank you. You have to vote for them. So these folks on the city council, starting from that point and all the way up to the federal branch of government, they have to believe that we as people with disabilities matter. Okay? I'm going to have Dolores speak to this issue. It is essential that we vote because otherwise, if the city council and further up looks at their constituents and they don't see people with disabilities as a voting force, guess what? They don't care what we say. Okay? So at a very, core level, voting is important, and I'm going to bring this conversation around to Dolores to discuss that.
Yeah, voting is something I'm really passionate about and really excited about. So yeah, I mentioned earlier that everyone has a boss, right? You are all bosses of elected officials if you vote. So you are the boss of folks on city council, board of supervisors, school board, up into the state senate, your local assembly folks. You are their boss if you voted for them or if you vote, period. And so having that knowledge should be really empowering. I mean, it makes me feel really empowered. So I want to talk about people with disabilities and voting because there's a lot of reasons why people with disabilities don't vote. So what I think is important, I think the first step to touch on is the first step that you need to do in order to vote, which is register to vote. Every nonprofit can access voter registration forms through the Office of Elections, Alameda County. So that's one method. I was really lucky as a part of the Disability Organizing Network, which is a statewide network of people with disabilities who do community organizing, to give feedback to the Secretary of State on how to make the website for voting accessible for readers, accessible for any type of disability, basically. So the website for voting, or to register to vote, I should say, is registertovote.ca.gov. So if you aren't registered to vote, you can go to on your mobile phone, on a computer, and it is accessible by screen reader, so you can register to vote. It's super important to register your community to vote. That's another piece of the community organizing piece, is getting people to register to vote, because that's a super empowering tool that we can use in our organizing. One of the other things that I wanted to touch on with voting is that elected officials recognize the power in that. So I just want to share a story of some of the work that we did for the elections that took place last year, 2 years ago now. So I worked at the Center for Independent Living in Hayward, and we did a Get Out the Vote campaign. And Get Out the Vote campaigns have a specific structure that people have been following for decades. And what we did is we calculated what the discrepancy was between people with disabilities and without disabilities who voted. People without disabilities vote a lot less. I can't remember the specific statistic. So we looked at the amount of people who voted in the last election for city council, because that's what we were voting on. And we said, okay, if this is the number of people who voted in our city for city council, and we're going to assume that, or there's statistics that say people with disabilities vote less than, at a rate less than, how do we close that gap? And we did the math on that, which is like super complicated, but I can find it. I can have someone send the resources to find it out. We realized that if we could get 532 people to vote in the city of Hayward who have disabilities, we could close that gap between the rate of people with disabilities and without disabilities who voted. So that's what we focused on for about 2 months. We were registering people to vote, which is one step, but the key piece is actually getting them out to vote, which involved phone calls, involved postcard mailings, involved emails, all those traditional targeted tactics. When there was campaigning happening and city council was campaigning for people who were up running for city council seat, there was different types of community forums taking place. Naturally, a lot of community forums don't focus on disability issues. We're often an overlooked community. So we wanted one to be specific to disability issues, and it was organized by youth in our community. The entire campaign was organized and run by youth in our community. We had volunteers who were non-youth, but the leaders of the campaign were youth in our community. So we told the elected officials, hey, we're actually doing a Get Out the Vote campaign. We're targeting this many amount of voters, and we're doing it through this way. We're going to make this amount of phone calls, something like 3,000 phone calls, like a lot of phone calls. And we told them, we used that language of getting out the vote, and they automatically like flipped a switch and were like, whoa. So when we invited them to come to the forum for them to speak, to the candidates forum, and we introduced what the youth were doing and talked about it, they automatically flipped the switch and were like, whoa, there's power in this room. If I want a seat, I need to convince this room. And so they switched their platform, or they spoke more about their specific platforms related to youth and related to disability. And our campaign was super successful. We made a huge amount of phone calls. We reached a couple hundred people and convinced them to vote. We registered people to vote. So it was a really, really successful campaign, and it elevated what the organization was doing and the work the organization was doing. So the elected officials in our community know that they can come to that organization if they want to reach people with disabilities, and they can rely on us when they need to hear about people with disabilities. So that's part of the power of voting. So that's what I specifically wanted to touch on and emphasize, that voting has a really specific power, and it's super important to tap into. And the first step, of course, is registering to vote. But the biggest piece is making those phone calls. And there's ways to get lists. If you all signed in when you got here, registered when you got here, that's already a list. So come voting time, you call. One of you says, hey, I want to call everybody who has come to the center and given us their information. That's your list of voters. That's exactly the constituents that you want to be reaching. And so that's a really important piece, is to make sure you're getting people registered, of course, but the biggest piece is getting them to the polling place. So you're going to want to think about, how are people going to get a ride there? You can connect with other agencies locally. The NAACP historically has done rides to and from the polling place. So you may want to connect with your local NAACP chapter and talk about, hey, can we collaborate on giving rides to our community members to the polling place on this day? Polling places are required to be accessible. Alameda County, through the years that I was at Community Resources for Independent Living, we built a really strong relationship with them, and they're slowly getting better at making sure the machines are accessible. There's always hiccups, of course, but they're required to problem solve and make that happen. There's also a hotline that's run by, I believe, Disability Rights California, the day of the election, where you can call that hotline and say what your voting issue is, and they will send a lawyer representative to that polling place to make sure you can vote. So the biggest piece, again, is getting to the polling place, or if you vote by mail, making sure you send that in on time. And not only that, but you're, again, doing that community organizing piece and calling everybody and saying, hey, I want to make sure you vote. People are going to get annoyed with you, absolutely. But if you're going to call them a lot and say, hey, you remember the voter registration deadline's coming up. Did you make sure to register to vote? Hey, the mail-in ballot deadline is coming up. Are you going to send it in? One of the other things that I like doing when it comes to voting is having a meeting specifically to talk about what's on the ballot. The League of Women Voters does presentations that are nonpartisan to educate you on what's on the ballot. And so it's up to you to be educated and to educate your community, and there's resources for that. And then you can decide what it is that what and how you want to vote. But the important piece is that you're voting. Yeah.
So this is Michael again. I want to just say some words about some cases I've worked on to make voting more accessible for voters who are blind and have other types of print disabilities. So I have had the privilege of working on 2 cases on behalf of the California Council of the Blind against the first one was against the County of Alameda that addresses the issue that Dolores was just referencing, which is voting machine access and functionality. And then the more recent case that I'm working on now is also on behalf of the California Council of the Blind and a couple of individuals, and it's against the County of San Mateo and the Secretary of State of California, as well as a couple other actors, government actors, and it's all about getting access to vote-by-mail voting. So the earlier case about voting machine access pertained to just making sure that the county was taking the steps it needed to have these machines function properly. And that case settled shortly after I left Disability Rights Advocates in 2015, and Disability Rights Advocates is in the monitoring phase of that case, monitoring whether the county is complying with the settlement agreement and whether or not the voting machines are actually working for people. So I encourage those of you who are Alameda County voters, if you ever have problems with voting machines, that you reach out to Disability Rights Advocates, because they are empowered to take action to enforce the settlement agreement. And you might recall that I mentioned to you that in many situations the court retains oversight over a case and a settlement to enforce, and this is one of those situations. So if they aren't able to resolve the issue, they can go back to the court and have the court take action to enforce the settlement to make sure that the machines are actually working for people. So that's the earlier case. One of the exciting things about that case from a legal perspective, so on the ground, that case was great in that it helped set up a process and made sure there was monitoring, and that monitoring is still ongoing to today. But another thing that was exciting was that was one of the first cases, actually it was the first case where a court ruled that the ADA provides voters with the right to vote privately and independently. Up until then, there had been a number of cases that looked at what kind of access does the ADA require for people. And in the past, courts had rejected that. They had said, no, it's good enough that somebody can cast a vote, and it doesn't really matter whether they get to do it privately and independently or not. So that was the first time that a court said it needs to be private and independent to be equal access when other voters get that right and get that opportunity. So fast forward to today, or to the other case, which is the California Council of the Blind versus County of San Mateo. And I'm really excited about this case. So this is about access to vote-by-mail voting for blind voters. And what does that mean? So vote-by-mail voting is this process that many of you know of where you basically can sign up to get a ballot mailed to you. It's a paper ballot, comes in an envelope with a second envelope. You can fill it out and mail it back in. From the comfort of your home, you get a couple weeks to do it, and you don't have to get in line, you don't have to worry about whether the machine is going to work or not, but it's in paper and it's in print. And so that means that if you are blind, you won't be able to vote privately and independently on a vote-by-mail ballot because it's a printed document. It's not brailled or large print. So we filed a lawsuit against San Mateo County and then those various other Secretary of State and so on, other government actors, on behalf of California Council of the Blind and a couple of voters who are blind in San Mateo County, saying vote-by-mail voting is a program that you're offering, but you're not making it accessible to blind voters. And we had a hearing last July, in June 2016, and at that hearing, the court said, I think that this has to be made accessible and that the county and the state need to start offering accessible vote-by-mail voting. And so we entered into an agreement for a process to get an accessible vote-by-mail voting system made available here in California for use by not only San Mateo County, but any county and all counties. So there are a number of voting system vendors across the country, and two of them have been making their way through the process for getting approved by the state of California to be used in California. What does accessible vote-by-mail voting look like? What it is the opportunity to use your computer to download an accessible web page ballot that you would fill out with whatever screen reader you have on your system, and then you print out that ballot, and then you put it in the vote-by-mail envelope, like all the other voters would put their vote-by-mail ballots in their envelope, and then you mail it back. And then it gets, and then it would reach the elections official's office, and then they would add it into the standard, they would put it onto a standard machine-readable ballot, and it would be counted just like all the other vote-by-mail votes. And that's the process. I have myself tested a couple, I want to say maybe 4 different vote-by-mail voting systems like this. And our clients and several members of California Council of the Blind and other folks have tested systems that have come a long way towards now being very, very accessible. And I'm really excited that we are right now just probably days away from the first 1 or 2 systems possibly being certified for use in California as accessible vote-by-mail voting systems. And you know, if everything goes smoothly, we are expecting to see those systems start to get used very soon. In fact, the state of California passed a law about a week ago that requires that all counties that are not subject to this special vote scheme, that basically all counties offer vote-by-mail voting in an accessible manner by January 1st, 2020. So this is coming, and it's coming soon. And I phrased that little thing about the law in a strange way because there's this other law called SB 450 that was passed about a year ago, and it sets up this special process for all vote-by-mail voting, but one of the precursors for a county to be able to use that all vote-by-mail voting is that they have to have an accessible vote-by-mail voting system too. So if you put those two laws together, basically what it says is all counties are going to need to have accessible vote-by-mail voting, which is wonderful. I myself am a resident of Alameda County, and I am really counting down the days until we see accessible vote-by-mail voting here in Alameda County. I think that Alameda County is going. I'm sorry, San Mateo County, which is still part of our lawsuit, is going to be the first county where we see this happen. But I expect that it's going to spread to other counties soon. And I think that this is a really exciting solution because even when the voting machines at poll sites are working, they are sort of technology that people aren't necessarily as familiar with or as comfortable with as they might be with their own screen readers that they are using on a daily basis. So that is kind of my big update about voting. So Dolores talked about the importance of people with disabilities voting, and the other side of it is, I and the California Council of the Blind and my firm have been working hard to make sure that voting for voters with disabilities is as easy as possible. And so we're going to continue that work because right now there is still a lot of room for improvement.
Could we have a time check? I think somebody's paratransit just came, and I feel like that's going to start.
It's 2:37.
2:37. Okay. All right. We're doing pretty well. I want to make sure that we open up time for as many questions as possible, since I think I had to cut some people off. I'm sorry. I always think I project loud enough without one. I want to make sure, I know I cut some folks off, I think, before that had questions, because I wanted to make sure that we got to the voting aspect of this, which I think is really critical, because it's the foundation of everything. The fact that we got the Americans with Disability Act passed is because we had legislators on the national level who cared and thought that it was important enough to pass that legislation. So if you don't vote, none of that happens. Okay. Can we get to some questions before we wrap up? And I know we don't have a working second microphone anymore. So I think what we're going to need to do is, if you have a question, you need to say it, and I'll repeat it back to whoever the question is for.
My name is Ray. I have a question.
Okay, Ray, go ahead.
Whenever you hear about a class action suit, is there a minimum number of people that have to have a class action suit?
That's a great question, and yes, there is not a precise number of people, but the courts have generally said that the minimum is somewhere between 20 and 40. 40 definitely, most courts will say that if there are more than 40 people in the class, that you probably have the sufficient number. The sort of legal term of art is numerosity. You've satisfied the numerosity requirement, but yes, it's generally above 40. You're in safe sort of territory for having enough people in the class.
Thank you.
By the way, we got the mic working now.
Oh,
I see the person with their hand waving in the blue jacket. Yeah. What's your name? Dirk. Okay. One second. Wait for the mic, please.
What was the reward of the class action suit against AMC? 1 and 2? What, in the discovery, did you
discovered that AMC had really made fruitful efforts for litigation. And third, on the whatever the recovery was, did it go all into something rich like the lighthouse, or did a blind consumer get any recovery at all, even the skateboard? And lastly, on postage, you are asking every blind person to have a printer. I'm not sure that is a reasonable request. Oh, well, certainly a computer,
But printing out the
also a
form.
working printer.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first question, I want to make sure I got them. So the first question, was that the question about discovery in the AMC case?
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounded like your question is whether we learned during discovery about AMC having taken steps to address the access to audio description.
Yeah.
So that is a good question. So in the case, oftentimes what will happen is settlement will occur before discovery is completed. And that was what happened in our case. So we reached settlement before we completed discovery. And so we did some discovery, and in the discovery process, we learned some things about what AMC had done and hadn't done, but we didn't learn everything. We didn't complete discovery. So the answer to that question is, it's kind of, so we didn't learn enough about AMC's policies and practices, I would say, and sort of what they had been doing during the that period before we filed the lawsuit to have a good sense of, in total, whether they were taking a lot of steps to resolve the audio description problems. I will say that we did learn during the case that there were certainly some things that they were not doing that they could have been doing. So the second question was regarding the printer issue, correct?
Yeah.
Oh, money. So was there monetary relief? So actually, so the lawsuit was filed as a class action, but it was settled as an individual case, so it wasn't a class action settlement. So it was, there were 7 plaintiffs in the AMC case, and there was a settlement agreement, a contract between those 7 people and AMC, or 7 people, or 5 people plus the Lighthouse plus the California Council of the Blind. We filed our lawsuit under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which doesn't provide for damages. So there's no monetary relief available under the provision of the ADA that applies to private businesses when you file a private lawsuit. That is not true under state law. So like the state disability access law laws allow plaintiffs to seek monetary damages, what's called monetary relief, for disability access violations, but the federal ADA does not. So the answer to your question is the settlement agreement is primarily a what's called an injunctive relief settlement, which what that means is basically it has a bunch of policies and practices that AMC is going to adopt, but there isn't a component where AMC is paying some large amount of money in damages to anyone, any one person or to a class group.
Can I just, Michael, there was a question about the printer too.
Yeah, so I can answer the printer question. So I wanted to say, that's a really good question about sort of access to equipment, and you are not the first person to raise it. And so actually, we have not settled our case in San Mateo County, but we're aware that voters who have disabilities may not have access to all these types of equipment. I wanted to make a couple of points regarding that. So, we, our goal in settling our case in San Mateo County is to provide the broadest access possible, and so we are interested in addressing the issue you just pointed out, which is making sure that voters who have disabilities can use this system even if they don't have the equipment on hand. And there are different ways to do that. And some ways might involve, just hypothetically speaking, might involve providing access to accessible computers and printers at libraries, or at, I'm sorry?
Here at East Bay Center.
Right.
Here.
Yeah, or at like local disability service organizations such as the East Bay Center. Keeping in mind that this is a tool that you can access over the internet. It really doesn't matter where you are when you access it. So that is another way. Another method might be through, in certain situations, county election officials making themselves available for appointments where they bring computers and printers to folks who want to use this tool. These are different ways to provide access. Hypothetically speaking, I can't talk about ongoing settlement negotiations, but I just wanted to let you know that there are ways to address the issue you raise, and we're thinking about them. And in our case, we are planning to advocate for these types of different solutions to ensure broad access. So another thing I wanted to just point out is you would not necessarily need to use the system. This would be a vote by mail option. You would still be free to visit a poll site if you so desired. Some people really value this sort of civic experience of traveling to a poll site, waiting in line and voting in person. And that will remain an option even after these accessible vote-by-mail systems are made available in California.
There was somebody else that was starting the question, I believe. What? Okay, thank you.
Hi, I got a kind of general question that I'm asking myself a lot, which is, we all know that ACB and a lot of folks are very excited about structural negotiations, and in many situations it seems like a really good option for maybe keeping things out of court, whatever. But I am wondering, why aren't we in the disability community pushing for universal design, which would make it possible to not deal with many of these issues company by company and time after time after time, but would make it so that it was a general requirement, period?
Really good question.
This is Dolores. I know that there is a lot of folks who are really passionate about universal design, and in my work at Krill, we actually brought forth proposed resolutions to City Council on universal design. And when we talked about universal design to them and how it's cost effective, how it's accessible, how it's really doable, City Council was actually really excited about it. So the City of Fremont, City of Hayward, I believe City of Union City, all passed universal design resolutions. Fremont is the one that I remember being really excited about it, or the most excited about it. And so it's one of those things, again, where community organizing, it has to happen, because it's not a law, it's something that the community needs. There are aspects of universal design that are, obviously ADA appropriate, but it's really taken community effort, and that's one of those things that I would suggest starting at City Council and moving up from there. Yeah.
That's a great question. Yes.
Yes, she's handing you
Thank you, Dolores. Who's paratransit?
Yeah, it's their start.
All right, the paratransit exodus here is about to begin, I think.
Hey, at least they waited 10 minutes.
Exactly. So I think we need to wrap up here. Dolores and Michael, are you willing to stay for a few extra minutes in case people have questions? Okay, Dolores and Michael are going to stay. If you have specific questions for them for a few minutes, you can come up to the back. I really want to thank Dolores, Tejada, Michael Nunez for a wonderful presentation this afternoon.
And let's thank Leah.
We really appreciate it.
And I want to say very quickly that we have given you evaluation forms. We would love it, please, if you would really fill them out. Tell us what you think. I hope that you enjoyed and learned today. You seem to have participated well, and we really appreciate you coming. We have 3 more workshops lined up, so we hope that you will consider coming to them. And I want to thank everybody who has participated. It's a job well done, and you all have made it a great success. Thank you.
David is the one person here who does not need a microphone, I guess.
Yep.
It's the acting.
I think somebody had a question.
Question?
Yeah,